The student left work, got into her car, and disappeared without a trace. The police began to investigate this case, in which more and more disturbing facts appeared every day. However, it took many years to find the truth. When this case was finally solved, all participants in the process were outraged and annoyed by this outcome. Laura Salman was born on October 6, 1965 in the small American town of Seymour, Indiana. When she was little, her parents moved to Tennessee and settled in a city called Murfreesboro. From an early age, Laura fell in love with theater and regularly performed in school productions. She also won a children's beauty pageant, receiving the title of Little Miss Murfreesboro. Later, her parents divorced, and Laura began to live with her mother. However, she continued to see her father regularly as he continued to live in the same city. Laura also sometimes lived at his house, especially on weekends and holidays. After graduating from school with honors, the girl entered Tennessee State University and also got a part-time job in a store near the campus. Laura loved creativity very much. On May 31, 1984, when Laurie was 18, she finished her shift at the store at approximately 1 p.m. The girl planned to get to the university and attend a meeting at which the results of the year's academic performance were summed up. After that, she wanted to go to her grandmother to swim in her pool. However, Laura never showed up at the university, and no one has seen her since she left work. However, the girl's relatives and acquaintances did not immediately notice her absence. They all thought that Laura might be doing something else. This continued until the afternoon, when a local farmer came to the police station. He stated that he found a human body in one of his fields, and the police immediately went to the scene. There they saw a dead girl with all her clothes missing. The body was covered by 2 pairs of jeans, men's and women's, as well as a jacket, one of the sleeves, which was wrapped around the victim's neck. The police immediately noticed serious injuries on her head, and 2 stones lay nearby, covered in blood. The body was handed over to a medical examiner, who identified the deceased as Laura Salman. The cause of death was at least 10 blows to the head with a heavy object, as well as other injuries believed to have been caused by fists. In addition, experts found male semen on the girl's body. In general, they could not determine whether the victim was subjected to violence or had sexual intercourse before her death. Technologies for studying biological samples were not yet so developed, but experts assumed that the seed fell on her body many hours before her death. Forensic scientists who examined the things found next to the body made another interesting conclusion. Traces of semen were also found on the men's jeans, but it belonged to another person. DNA analysis was not yet used in those years, so it was impossible to identify the owners of these samples. All the experts could do was compare them and understand that they belonged to different people. After police spoke with Laura's relatives, they realized that her car was missing. Considering that there might be some evidence there, they began searching and were soon able to find her. The car was parked in the parking lot of the store where the victim worked. This was strange, since Laura left there immediately after finishing her shift. Having examined the car, experts discovered even more oddities. There were not a single fingerprint inside, not even of Laura herself. This indicated that her killer could have thoroughly wiped down the interior, which means he was the one who drove the car back to the store. A man's hair was also found in the cabin, as well as traces of soil next to the driver's seat. They were sent to a laboratory, where experts were able to determine that the soil did not match samples taken near where the body was found for comparison. Thus, the police admitted that Laura herself came to that field, after which they killed her, and drove the car back to the store. Detectives began to build a chronology of events by interviewing the girl's friends and relatives. After talking with her father, with whom Laura had been living for the last few days, they learned that the day before her death, the girl and her best friend went to a club located in neighboring Nashville. Returning from there, the friends stayed overnight with Laura. The next morning, the girl had a shift at the store from 9 o'clock Her friend also worked there, but on a different shift. Despite this, they both went there in Laura's car, after which her friend went home. They haven't seen each other since then. The friend returned to the store at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Laura's car was not there. But when the girl looked outside, an hour and a half later, she, to her surprise, noticed her car in the parking lot. She found this strange, because Laura's shift had ended long ago, and she had no reason to return. And besides, the girl was nowhere to be seen. Laura's colleague, with whom she worked in the morning, told about their conversation shortly before her shift. The girl told her that she was going to go to her grandmother's house to swim in the pool. She also added that after work, Laura changed into her usual clothes, which included the same jeans that covered her body. After the police spoke with Laura's parents and friends, they had their first suspect. The girl's mother and several of her friends told detectives that her boyfriend, 17-year-old Kayla Gelia, may have committed the murder. Based on their stories, the couple had a very problematic relationship. They started dating back in school. In recent months, Laura has wanted to finish this novel. The reason for this was the behavior of Kyle, who was constantly jealous of her and tried to control her in everything, and also sometimes raised his hand to her. The girl repeatedly tried to break up with him, but Kyle became furious, which is why she was seriously afraid of the young man. As a result, Laura simply tried to avoid him, but at the same time they still continued to see each other regularly, since he would not leave her alone. Laura's best friend added that she sometimes went on dates with other guys, but tried to keep it a secret because she was afraid that Kyle might hurt her. While detectives were interviewing girls they knew, Kyle called her father's house and asked where Laura was. The man did not tell him that she was dead, but instead asked him to go to the police station because investigators wanted to ask him some questions. Kyle arrived there immediately. He told detectives he didn't know the girl was dead. According to him, the last time they saw each other was the day before the murder at her grandmother's house. She came to swim in the pool and was planning to go there again the next day. However, on May 31, the guy could not find her until the girl's father told him to come to the police. Kyle added that that day he slept at home almost until the evening. The young man worked the night shift, so he returned home at approximately 7 o'clock, after which he went to bed. His father confirmed this. The man came home around 3 o'clock, and Kyle was in his bed. Considering that, according to medical experts, the victim was killed somewhere around 1500 hours, Kyle would not have had time to commit this crime. He said he left the house around 5 o'clock and planned to meet Laura, but couldn't find her, so he went back home. Given that investigators had no evidence against Kyle, and his father confirmed his alibi, they continued to look for other leads and possible suspects. Sometime later, a woman from Nashville contacted police. She said that a man assaulted her when the woman tried to fight him off. The criminal said that if she resisted, he would do to her the same thing he did to Laura Salman. Detectives immediately threw all their efforts into searching for this man, and he was soon arrested. They immediately noticed that the guy studied at the same university as Laura, went to the same gym with her, and often attended student parties, which the girl was also present at. In addition, he had a criminal history involving violence and cruelty towards women. After interviewing students who were familiar with the criminal, the police found out that he was seen on campus on the very day that Laura was killed. Having collected all the facts together, detectives came to the conclusion that he could be the killer. Forensic scientists from the FBI laboratory compared the hair found in Laura's car with the suspect's hair. DNA analysis was still unavailable in those years, but experts concluded that these hairs were very similar and could belong to the same person. However, investigators faced one problem. The men's jeans that covered the victim's body were too big for the suspect, so they could hardly have belonged to him. Moreover, the hair comparison was not powerful enough to arrest the man for murder, leaving the detectives at a dead end. The young man was charged with abusing another girl, but it was not possible to link him with Laura's murder. Since then, there has been no serious progress in this matter. In subsequent years, police identified more than 100 new suspects, but all of them sooner or later ceased to be considered as possible murderers. When DNA technology began to be widely used, experts compared a hair from Laura's car with the DNA of this young man who had been arrested for abusing another girl. The results showed that the hair belonged to different people, so he was also removed from the list of suspects. In 2000, 16 years after Laura's murder, the case was transferred to the Unsolved Homicide Unit. The investigation was led by a new detective named Dan Goodwin, who knew Laura in his youth. They studied at the same university and communicated well, and just 4 days before her death we went to the cinema together. Moreover, at the girl's funeral, Dan approached her mother and promised to someday solve this case. However, he did not immediately become a police officer. After university, the man began working as a journalist and even wrote several articles about this case. Later, he realized that he wanted to become an investigator and changed his field of activity. And as a result, Laura's case became one of his first investigations. And despite his lack of experience, he took on it with maximum responsibility. Having begun to analyze the materials on this case, Dan immediately discovered that his predecessors had made a number of serious mistakes. The police investigating the area where the body was found collected all the evidence without wearing gloves, and also did not block off the area, which is why anyone could go there. Moreover, sometime after the discovery of the body, Laura's father went to that field and found his daughter's necklaces there, as well as several more stones covered in blood. Apparently, the police simply did not notice these items, and the father collected them and took them to the station himself, which automatically compromised potential evidence. Despite all this, Dan started the investigation virtually from scratch. He requested a re-examination of semen samples found on the victim's body and on the men's jeans that covered the body. While he was waiting for the results, interesting information reached him. He was told that one of the students at the local high school often spoke to other students about Laura's case. According to this teenager, his own father killed the girl and threw her body in that field. The man allegedly confessed to him what he had done shortly before his death. After researching the man's background, Dan discovered that he had an impressive criminal history. Because the man was already dead, experts were unable to match his DNA with semen samples found at the crime scene. So they asked for DNA from his children, who agreed to provide samples. The DNA of relatives has a certain similarity, but they do not coincide with each other 100%. However, such an analysis was enough to check the likelihood of the man's involvement in the murder. However, here Dan was waiting for a dead end. The man's DNA samples were completely different from those found on the body and jeans. Thus, the man was excluded from the list of suspects. As for the analysis of crime scene samples itself, it did not yield any results. Both seed owners were not in the FBI database, so the detective could only compare them with samples of the suspects. He even passed his own sample since he knew Laura and communicated with her a few days before her death. But it also did not match. Thus, Dan had no new leads left and decided to re-examine the victim's boyfriend. He had an alibi for the time of the murder. However, the detective found a very interesting note in the old files. It contained information about the testimony of a witness that radically changed this case. In 1984, she contacted the police. She said that on the day of Laura's murder, at about 1500 hours, she was driving from work less than a kilometer from the place where the women found her body, and stopped before turning because she had to let the car in front of her pass. However, the car did not move, which was quite strange. The woman waited for some time for the driver to finally drive, and he continued to stand still. During this time, she got a good look at the car and the driver himself. She remembered that the young man behind the wheel looked ahead with an empty gaze and did not move at all. A few days later, The woman saw footage of Laura's car on the news and realized that it was the same car. When the witness contacted the police, they showed her photographs of several suspects. Without any doubt, she immediately pointed to Kyle. She was the one who saw him driving that car. A few weeks later, she was again invited to the station, where the young man was placed next to other men, and the woman again pointed to him. It turned out that this testimony refuted the alibi of Kyle, who at that time was supposed to be sleeping at home. In addition, according to the witness, he was driving towards the store where Laura worked, and it was there that her car would later be found. However, in those years, investigators apparently did not attach much importance to her words. However, they still wouldn't have had enough evidence to charge Kyle with murder. Dan found this witness, and she confirmed her story. According to the woman, to this day she remembered the shock she felt when she saw the photo of the car and Kyle. She had no doubt that it was this man who was driving the car of the murdered girl. The detective re-interviewed several more witnesses who appeared in the case. When he reached the woman named Kim, something interesting awaited him. She lived next to Laura's father's house and was friends with her. So in 1984, the police invited her to the station to give evidence. She arrived there almost at the same time as Kyle, after which the young man asked Kim to give him a ride to the girl's father's house. They arrived there and went into the house together to express condolences to the man. At some point, Kyle went into Laura's room, and when Kim followed him, she saw him rummaging through her things and taking some letters. After that, Kyle and Kim went to a party together, where the young man had fun and had a good time, even though his girlfriend was killed just a few hours ago. But that's not all. During the party, the guy began to pester Kim. She said it was wrong, but Kyle said Laura was dead anyway. After the party, they went outside together, where Kyle continued to flirt with her. When the conversation turned to Laura again, he began to say that it was her own fault and that she should not have acted like that. Kim found his words extremely strange and began to seriously fear Kyle. She said that she urgently needed to go home and left there. At the same time, the girl did not report all this information to the police and told the detective about it only 16 years later, when he himself came to her. Digging into this case, Dan found a woman named Shelley. She met Kyle a few months after Laura's murder and was a year younger than him. After one of the parties, the guy took her to the outskirts of the city to the same place where the girl's body was found in order to have an intimate relationship with her. There, a quarrel arose between them, during which Kyle asked her if she wanted to end up like Laura Salman. Apparently, the girl had not heard about this case and asked who it was. Kyle replied with a smile on his face that she was his girlfriend and he killed her. When Shelley returned home, she told her father about this, but the man advised her not to tell anyone about what she had heard. Apparently, he feared that Kyle might actually harm his daughter. The girl listened to him and kept this secret for 16 years. While the detective was searching and interviewing witnesses, specialists from the laboratory told him about one interesting discovery while studying a man's pair of jeans. They found tiny spatters of Laura's blood on them, below the knees. This meant that the criminal was wearing jeans at the moment when he struck the lying victim, bending over her head. Thus, Dan only had to find the owner of the DNA of the seed of these jeans. His guilt in the murder would be proven. Given that all this pointed to Kyle's involvement, the detective focused on finding him to take a DNA sample. It turned out that 2 years after the murder, the man moved to Florida, where he worked in the government department. Kyle was married twice and had a young daughter, but both marriages did not last long. Digging into his file, Dan found out something else. Just 4 months after Laura's death, he tied up a 16-year-old girl and abused her. But for some reason the guy was found innocent. The detective contacted the sheriff of the county in which Kyle lived and asked for help with the case. The policeman agreed and called the man in for questioning, where he asked him a series of questions about Laura's murder. Kyle still insisted that he had nothing to do with him. He also stated that he was never near the place where her body was found. However, the sheriff obtained a court order and took a DNA sample from him, after which he sent it to Dan. On May 31, 2000, the exact anniversary of Laura's death, experts extracted Kyle's DNA profile and matched it to a semen sample found on the jeans. The result showed a complete match. Before arresting him, investigators spent several months compiling all the evidence and witness statements to bring the case to trial. When the job was completed, Dan personally went to Florida to interrogate him. He told Kyle what he had learned from witnesses and the DNA match. But the man continued to deny everything. According to him, he and Laura had no problems, and their relationship was completely free. They each dated other people periodically, and Kyle wasn't jealous of her at all. He also repeated that he was never near the place where her body was found, and did not go to her father's house, and did not take letters from the girl's things, and never even visited her on the university campus. An unpleasant surprise awaited the man here. Dan, who studied at that same university in those years, personally saw Laura with Kyle on campus, which automatically refuted his testimony. Moreover, delving into the transcripts of old interrogations, the detective found Kyle's testimony in which he admitted that he had been near the field where the victim's body was found several times. After listening to all this, Kyle demanded a lawyer and refused to continue the conversation. The man was then arrested and charged with Laura's murder. He was deported to Tennessee, and initially Kyle's case was handled in juvenile court. Despite the fact that he was 35 at the time of the murder, Kyle's age was 17 years old. However, during the preliminary hearing, it was decided to try him as an adult, and the case was transferred to another court. The man's bail was set at $500,000. His relatives contributed this amount. Since then, he continued to live in freedom for several more years while the parties prepared for the trial. Due to constant delays, it began only in August 2006. The prosecution invited witnesses that Dan found. Among them were a woman who saw Kyle driving Laura's car, Shelley, to whom he confessed to the murder and threatened to do the same, as well as Keem, who went to see the victim's father with Kyle. In addition to them, various acquaintances of Laura and her mother spoke at the trial. They all shared their observations of various episodes in which Kyle raised his hand to the girl and threatened her. Laura's mother said that she regularly saw her daughter with bruises. Moreover, several times Kyle attacked Laura right in front of her eyes. He grabbed her, beat her, and threatened her with violence. Several of Laura's friends made similar statements. They repeatedly witnessed Kyle physically abusing the girl. Her friends tried to convince her to leave Kyle, but she replied that in that case he could kill her. It is noteworthy that some of Laura's friends even went to the police and said that the guy beat her in front of their eyes. However, for some reason the police did not take any action. Another friend said that a few months before Laura's death, she saw letters from her written by Kyle. In them, he wrote that he loved her, and also almost directly threatened her if the girl tried to leave him. Given the testimony of another witness who saw Kyle taking some letters from Laura's room after the murder, the conclusion suggested itself. After all the witnesses spoke, the prosecution presented its version of events. As we remember, male semen was found on the victim's body, which did not match Kyle's DNA. The medical expert who conducted the analysis spoke at the trial and said that this biological material got there at least 24 hours before the girl's death. Based on this, the prosecution suggested that the day before her death, Laura entered into an intimate relationship with someone else, and Kyle could have found out about it. When she finished her shift at work, the guy could have ambushed her and asked her to go for a ride with him. Once on that field, he began to beat the girl, after which he struck her many times with stones lying nearby. He then took off her clothes, covered her body, and later covered her with his jeans, which had traces of blood on them. In order not to take this evidence with him, he then got into the victim's car, drove to her store, wiped the entire interior of fingerprints, and abandoned the car. Kyle's lawyer maintained his client's innocence. He became obsessed with the fact that the police had never been able to find the owner of the seed found on Laurie's body, and tried to shift the blame onto him. However, his version was contradicted by the testimony of a medical expert who established that a biological sample appeared on the victim's body at least a day before the murder. In addition, he could not explain how his client's jeans with Laura's blood on them ended up at the murder scene. The lawyer also invited Kyle's brother, who said that on the day of the murder he returned home from work between noon and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and at that time was sleeping in his room. The brother added that the young man woke up closer to 4 o'clock. But there was a snag here too. After this court hearing, investigators found out that while Kyle was still in custody, his brother wrote him a letter in which he promised to provide an alibi. As for their father, who also gave Kyle an alibi, the man died long before the trial, so it was impossible to verify his testimony. The trial ended within weeks, with the jury unanimously finding Kyle guilty of murder. A man was sentenced to life imprisonment, but there was one caveat. Since the murder occurred in 1984, he was sentenced according to the laws of those years. According to them, Kyle may be released early in 2042. A man filed numerous appeals, but they were all rejected, and he remains in prison to this day. Detective Dan Goodwin later expressed his disappointment with the way the police behaved during those years. From the complete lack of response to calls about Laura's beating to the mistakes made in the investigation of her murder. Perhaps if they had taken all this more seriously, the girl would be alive.